can still feel the sting of that moment, the warm smear on my cheek, the sharp silence that followed, and the way the morning light hit the kitchen tiles as if spotlighting my humiliation. My own home suddenly felt foreign, like the walls were holding their breath, waiting to see what I'd do. If you've ever been blindsided by someone you trusted, subscribe and tell me where you're listening from. These moments carve themselves into you. I stood there, stunned, hearing only the faint hum of the refrigerator and my own heartbeat pulsing in my ears, realizing something inside me had cracked in a way I couldn't ignore. That was the moment everything started to unravel. I still remember the sting of that moment as if it's happening right now. 1 second I was standing in my own kitchen, trying to keep the peace, and the next I felt the warm shock of spit on my cheek. It was the kind of disrespect I never imagined I would face in my own home, especially from someone I had opened my door to. For a heartbeat, everything around me went quiet. Even my breathing felt foreign, like my body couldn't decide whether to fight, cry, or freeze. And then came the part that cut deeper than the spit itself. My son didn't rush to check on me. He didn't step between us. Instead, I watched him choose silence, watched him look away as if my humiliation was something I had somehow earned. In that moment, I felt something inside me shift, like a small crack forming in a place I once believed was unbreakable. I tried to hold myself together as I walked away, but my thoughts were spinning. 40 years in this house, raising a family, surviving losses, celebrating milestones, and somehow I'd become invisible in my own story. I kept replaying the moment, trying to understand how things had reached this point, how love had twisted into something so unrecognizable. That night, I barely slept. Shock slowly hardened into something sharper, something colder, and by the time the sun rose, I realized I wasn't done. Not yet. Because the next morning, everything shifted again, and it wasn't in the way anyone expected. I used to think my home would always be a place of calm, even after I retired. For a long time, it was. The rooms felt familiar, the routine steady, and the quiet suited me. All of that shifted the day Evan and Lauren called to tell me they had lost their apartment. They sounded desperate, and as a mother, I felt that old instinct to shelter them. I opened my door without hesitation, telling myself it would be temporary, just a bridge until they steadied their lives again. But weeks became months, and I slowly realized the atmosphere in my house had changed. It started small, almost invisible at first. My things moved to new places without my knowing. My kitchen, once organized the way I liked it, slowly shifted toward their preferences. They took over the living room as if it were theirs, leaving their belongings wherever they landed. I tried to be patient, reminding myself that everyone was stressed, that starting over was hard, that I should give them room to breathe. Still, the uneasiness grew. Little comments from Lauren lingered longer than they should have, hinting that I was too particular or too set in my ways. Evan, overwhelmed and embarrassed about losing their place, seemed to withdraw, letting her shape the tone of the house. I kept telling myself to stay calm, to remember he was my son, that families go through difficult seasons, but inside, I felt myself shrinking, as though each week pushed me further to the edges of my own home. I would walk through the hallway and feel like a guest. I would enter the kitchen and feel like an intruder. The peace I once took for granted dissolved into tension that clung to every corner of the house. And the worst part was the quiet fear that none of this was accidental. Something heavier was building beneath the surface, pressing closer each day. I didn't know when it would break, only that the moment was coming, and I could feel it approaching like a storm right outside my door. It worried. I remember closing my bedroom door that night and feeling the weight of it settle behind me, as if I were sealing myself off from a world that no longer made sense. I sat on the edge of my bed, hands trembling, trying to steady my breath. The humiliation replayed over and over in my mind, each memory cutting deeper than the last. I kept wondering how I had reached a point where my own home didn't feel like mine, where my voice carried no weight, where my son stood by as if my pain were just another inconvenience. As the night stretched on, the house felt impossibly quiet. I looked around my room, the one space that still held traces of the life I had built. Pictures from years when Evan was small, letters from loved ones who were no longer here, small reminders of a time when this house felt like a sanctuary. It struck me then just how much I had given, how much I had tolerated, and how blind I had been to the slow erosion of respect. Somewhere between the memories and the silence, something inside me hardened. The hurt was still there, sharp and raw, but beneath it was a growing clarity. I realized I had been shrinking myself to keep the peace, forgetting that this house was not just walls and furniture, it was my life's work. And I still had options. I still had resources tucked away, decisions I could make, steps I could take. They didn't know everything about me, not really. By the time the clock crept toward early morning, the trembling had stopped. I felt a steadiness I hadn't felt in years. I knew I couldn't undo what had happened, but I could decide what happened next, and I promised myself that when the sun came up, things would not continue the way they had. Something would change. Starting in the morning, I woke before the sun, long before the house stirred. The air felt different, lighter somehow, as if the storm from the night before had swept through and left a clear path behind it. I moved quietly through the kitchen, turning on a single light as the first thin lines of dawn stretched across the windows. There was a steadiness in my hands that surprised me. No shaking, no hesitation, just purpose. I began cooking, letting the familiar motions ground me. The sound of eggs whisking, the scent of bacon crisping, the warmth rising from the stove. All of it felt intentional, almost ceremonial. For years, I had used food as a way to smooth over tension, to keep peace, to hold the house together. But this morning, the breakfast wasn't an offering. It was a stage I was setting, one I needed to control. As I laid out the plates, I found myself thinking about the quiet phone call I had made the night before. I didn't dwell on it, but knowing someone would arrive shortly, a person who understood boundaries and consequences, gave me a sense of calm I hadn't felt in months. I didn't need to explain everything yet. Their presence would speak for itself when the time came. The house began to shift around me as footsteps sounded upstairs. A door closed. Soft conversation drifted down the hallway. I could picture them moving slowly, unaware that anything had changed. I took a final breath, steady and full. I wasn't afraid anymore. I was ready. And as I heard them descending the stairs, I knew the next few minutes would redefine everything. They came into the kitchen with the same casual entitlement they had carried for months, expecting me to shrink back into silence. I could see it in the way Lauren moved first, scanning the room as if she owned it, and in the half-awake confidence on Evan's face as he followed behind her. But the moment they noticed the table, their steps faltered. The breakfast spread looked almost ceremonial, every plate placed with intention. And then their eyes landed on the man seated quietly at the end of the table, reviewing a folder he had brought with him. I watched the change wash over them. Confusion first, then suspicion, then something closer to fear flickering behind their eyes. They weren't used to surprises from me. They certainly weren't expecting this one. Inside, I felt a stillness I hadn't felt in years. It wasn't revenge. It wasn't bitterness. It was the calm that comes when you finally stop asking for respect and start enforcing it. As we all took our seats, I could feel them waiting, expecting an explanation, bracing for a confrontation. I didn't raise my voice. I didn't recount the night before. Instead, I let my thoughts settle, knowing the message would be clear. I spoke calmly about my decision to update my estate, about making sure my affairs were handled responsibly, about setting boundaries regarding my home and who lived in it. I watched their faces shift with each word, their confidence unraveling as they realized this wasn't a discussion. It was a declaration. Their reactions played out silently, but I could read every emotion: panic, calculation, a quiet, dawning realization that whatever power they believed they held had evaporated. And for the first time in a long time, I felt myself reclaiming the space around me, my home, my choices, my future. The tension in the room thickened as the lawyer closed his folder, and I could tell they sensed there was more coming, something deeper than estate papers or household rules. And they were right. The real revelation hadn't surfaced yet, but it was about to. After the breakfast confrontation, the house fell into a strange stillness. Evan and Lauren kept their distance, moving around as if the floor itself had become fragile. I stayed quiet too, but inside my mind, everything was turning. I needed clarity, real clarity. So I went to the storage room where I kept the things that mattered most to me. I hadn't been in there for a while, mostly because I didn't want to see how much of my life had been pushed aside to make room for theirs. As I started sorting through boxes, I found items I thought had gone missing. A few pieces of jewelry I rarely wore but treasured. A watch my late husband had saved years to buy. Even an old envelope with savings I had set aside for emergencies, all tucked into odd places, as if someone had been rifling through my belongings. I tried to tell myself it was just carelessness, but the feeling in my stomach told me otherwise. Later, I took out the bills and paperwork I had been avoiding, letting myself look at them with fresh eyes. As I compared dates and amounts, it became painfully obvious that Evan and Lauren were in far deeper financial trouble than they ever admitted. Credit card balances that never went down, new purchases that didn't make sense, patterns that pointed not to bad luck, but to habits. Habits built on the assumption that I would catch them every time they fell. It hit me then. They hadn't come to my house out of desperation alone. They came because leaning on me had become a part of their plan, an expectation, almost a strategy. The realization tightened something in my chest, not out of anger but out of understanding. I had been trying to save a situation that was quietly consuming me, and yet, even with all I had uncovered, I could feel there was something bigger beneath the surface, something I still hadn't seen. I just didn't know how close I was to finding it. It happened on an ordinary afternoon, the kind where I was trying to keep myself busy just to quiet my thoughts. My phone rang with a number I didn't recognize. Normally, I would have let it go to voicemail, but something in me felt nudged to answer. The voice on the other end introduced himself, explaining that he was settling the final paperwork for a distant relative I barely remembered. I almost dismissed it, until he mentioned an old commercial property my uncle had purchased decades ago and left in my name. For a moment, I genuinely thought he had confused me with someone else. I had lived my entire life believing I had only enough to take care of myself. But as he explained the details, the location, the appreciation over the years, the current valuation, I felt the world tilt slightly beneath me. The number he mentioned wasn't small. It was life-changing. After the call ended, I sat in my car for a long time, hands resting on the steering wheel, letting the quiet wrap around me. The wind outside shook the branches in a gentle rhythm, and I stared out the window trying to understand how something so significant had existed without my knowing. I had spent months feeling cornered, dependent on patience and endurance, while the truth was that I had been standing on solid ground the entire time. What surprised me most wasn't the money, it was the shift inside me. A realization that I didn't owe chaos my peace, that I didn't have to enable grown adults who had made entitlement a lifestyle. Evan and Lauren had built a future in their minds using resources they assumed were mine, never once considering that my security belonged to me, not to them. As I sat there, a calm certainty settled over me. This revelation wasn't just financial, it was emotional. It marked the moment I understood my independence in a way I never had before. And with that understanding came a new resolve, one that would shape everything that happened next. In the days that followed the financial revelation, something softened and sharpened at the same time. I felt steadier, more grounded, almost as if the truth had settled the dust that had been clouding my vision for months. And strangely, that shift inside me seemed to ripple outward. Evan and Lauren began to move differently in the house, not with fear, but with an awareness I hadn't seen in a long time. There were real consequences they had to face. They took on extra work, long hours at jobs they once dismissed as beneath them. I noticed them budgeting, planning, and for the first time, acknowledging the weight of their own decisions. It wasn't perfect, not by any stretch, but there was a sincerity to their effort that felt new. I kept my boundaries firm. I didn't rush to fix things for them, and I didn't offer financial help beyond what was reasonable and healthy. And with that space, something unexpected happened. They started standing on their own. Evan would come home tired but proud. Lauren, who once carried herself with constant defensiveness, began to show small gestures of respect, cleaning the kitchen without being asked, checking in before making changes around the house. I won't pretend everything healed overnight. Hurt doesn't vanish just because growth begins, but I felt a cautious hope taking root. Not a naive hope, the kind that ignores truth, but the kind born from watching people learn through consequence. For the first time in a long while, I felt we were all moving towards something healthier. And as I sat with that realization, I knew it was time to share the deeper meaning behind all of this. The lesson I carried with me. Looking back, I realized this journey wasn't just about reclaiming my home. It was about reclaiming myself. I learned that boundaries aren't walls. They're doors we choose when to open. I learned that respect grows when we stop carrying what isn't ours. And I learned that strength can feel quiet, steady, and deeply human. Watching my family grow has brought me a gentler hope, one rooted in truth instead of fear. If you've ever faced something like this, finding your voice again, setting limits, or rebuilding trust, I'd love to hear your story. Share it in the comments. I read every one,